Okay, by shake of your heads, can you hear me? Okay, good. All right, so continuing from where we were last week, just a brief overview. We did a brief overview of Torah Shabbal Peh. I sent out a little chart that I think very nicely covers what we had looked at in terms of the idea of what we call oral Torah in terms of Halacha Moshe Sinai, that which was given to Moshe on Mount Sinai, and then what we call the various forms of rabbinic extension of that down to Zerot, Takanot, etc. So you have that chart that you can refer to. We talked about the idea of machloket. We talked about it in kind of a metaphysical sense in terms of the creation, the story of creation, and how the separation on the second day of the upper waters and the lower waters, and that this idea of that separation, of that machloket, had both destructive and redeeming qualities, and that the idea that the tension between the two, right, ultimately lead to tov. Ultimately, tov is the idea of trying to create that sense of shleimut, of completeness in creation, because by the end of the 6 days of creation, God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was all good. We talked about that. Then we talked about the idea of rabbinic authority, which we're going to go into in a much deeper sense this evening. And then hopefully by next week, we'll get into really much more contemporary setting of how this all fits together in terms of the various issues that we are confronted with as modern Orthodox Jews. But in order to get there, we have to answer a few more questions. We have to talk about a few more ideas that we'll get to at the end of, towards the end of class, which really is, what is the meaning of Dat Torah, Das Torah? What is Amunat Chachamim? What is basically the word of Torah and basically Torah knowledge, the ultimate authority of rabbis, and Amunat Chachamim, faith in the words of the Chachamim. So, but before we talked about the idea of rabbinic authority is invested in two ways. We're going to extend on this. One is smicha. Smicha, which we call today ordination, really is, it was earned through two things. It was earned through scholarship, right? Mastering all material, all the previous material, and personality, and a sincere desire to seek shleimut. And we define shleimut, wholeness, if you recall, as this kind of seeking to minimize the tension between truth and peace. In other words, the rabbi's rabbinic authority role is to try to get as close as possible to divine truth, but to fit it into human reality. And when you can take divine truth and fit it into human reality, then in effect, you have created this idea of shleimut, if you recall, Talmidei Chachamim Marbin Shalom Ba'olam, remember last class, right, that the Talmidei Chachamim, the scholars, the sages, the rabbis bring peace to the world. Shenemar, as it says, V'chol binayich limudei Hashem v'rav shalom banayich, right? All your children should be knowledgeable of God, should be students of the Torah of God. V'rav shalom banayich, and great should be the peace of your children. The peace, shalom, shouldn't be, banayich shouldn't be read, your children of bonayich, your builders. That your sages are your builders who are building together through their knowledge, right? Through their knowledge base, their expertise in the texts, through their personality, and through their desire to bring this shleimut. And those that can attain that level, we give them smicha, so to speak, and they have what we call rabbinic authority. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about this rabbinic authority, because this is really critical. When we talk about modern orthodoxy, right, we're immediately talking about two ideals. Orthodoxy, right? Ortho means the correct, the right. Orthodoxy, the correct path, a correct belief. That's what orthodoxy means, right? Modern means contemporary. And so it might be even an oxymoron to use the phrase modern orthodoxy, because if you have the right belief, it doesn't matter where or when or what you live. But modern orthodoxy says, right, that we value, right, the avira, we value the environment in which we find ourselves. We value general education where it's appropriate. So when we talk about modern orthodoxy and we talk about rabbinic authority, we have to figure out how does that fit, right? Because you're almost standing like at the top of at the pinnacle, and there's like two slopes, right? If you go down just the slope of orthodoxy, then modern means nothing. It's all about what does the Torah say, what does rabbinic authority have to say? And if you say we're looking at the social, historical reality that we live in, then how does that not, can it influence both your orthodoxy and your well, not your orthodoxy, but your orthoprax? Can it define what is correct practice in that situation, right? Or is there only one way? And it doesn't matter where or when you live or exist. So we have to kind of stretch the canvas for us so that we can address that issue, hopefully beginning next week, and maybe for 2 or 3 classes beginning next week. Okay, so here's where I want to begin. So we have a verse in the Torah, in Devarim, in Deuteronomy, chapter 17, verse 11. And the verse is, I think I sent this out to all of you, Al pi ha-Torah asher yerucha, right? You shall act in accordance with the instructions, Bi'al ha-mishpat asher yomru lecha ta'aseh lo ta'aseh min hadavar asher yagidu lach yamin u'shmol. You shall act in accordance with the instructions given you and the ruling handed to you. You must not deviate from the verdict that they announce to you, either to the right or to the left. So who is those giving the instruction to you? Those that will be your religious leaders in your day, right? In the time of the Chumash, it was Moshe, then it was Yehoshua, right? Then it was the elders, then it was the prophets, and then it became ultimately the rabbis. We'll do a little bit of a history lesson along the way. But according to everything they instruct you, you shall not deviate right or left, right? So you have to follow the instructions and the decisions of the rabbis. So Rashi on this, and again, I sent you these sources. Rashi says on this, even if he, the judge, tells you, and this is a source both from the Gemara and Midrash, he tells you, the rabbi, the rabbinic authority tells you about what appears to be right, that it is left, about what appears to be left, that it is right, you shall obey him. How much the more so, right? How much the more so if this is if he actually tells you about what is evidently right, that it is right, and about what is left, that it is left. So in other words, even of what seems to you so logically to be clear that this is the correct action, this is the correct interpretation, he tells you it's this, you have to follow this. We'll come back to that in a moment. So the Ramban, on this very same statement, quotes Rashi, and then he says, the meaning thereof is that even if you think in your heart that they are mistaken, and the matter is simple in your eyes, just as you know the difference between your right hand and your left hand, you must still do as they command you. So the Ramban is trying to, first of all, make it a little clear. In other words, it's from your perspective, you think it's this clear, right? It's your right hand. And they're telling you it's the left hand. You have to follow their command. Now, why is that? Logic might dictate that they know more than you do, right? You think you have the answer, but you're missing a piece. So the Ramban goes on. He said that the need for this commandment is very great, for the Torah was given to us in written form. If you remember, we had the Torah shebichtav in written form, and it is known that not all opinions occur on newly arising matters, as we said last week. In other words, the Torah shebichtav and even some of the Torah shebal peh doesn't take into account new situations that arise, right? They have to be interpreted. They have to be fit into, do they fit into this category or that category? And so disagreements would thus increase, and the one Torah would become many Torahs. In other words, if there wasn't a guiding principle, and there weren't guiding principles, and we weren't those who were the experts and the authorities, and how we apply those guiding principles, everybody, the Torah would split into many different Torah. As it is, there are manifestations of that, whether it be Ashkenazi tradition versus Sephardi tradition. But those are all within, that's a discussion for another evening. Scripture, therefore, defined the law that we have to obey, the great court that stands before God, the place that he chose. And this is a reference to basically how was halacha decided in the time of, from Moshe Rabbeinu all the way up until almost the end of the Second Temple period, which was that we had a series of courts, and we ultimately had a Sanhedrin Hagadol, right? We had the great court, just like every court system, where ultimately they were the final decisors, and their decision was final. And as a result of that, there were no disputes, because you could appeal it up to the Sanhedrin Hagadol. And he says that even if they show you before your own eyes that right is left and that left is right, obey them. So in other words, rabbinic authority may seem, according to this, to be infallible. So let's take it one step further. So the Rambam, not the Ramban, but the Rambam basically parses this out a little bit better. So he says, the Supreme Court in Jerusalem represents the essence of the oral Torah. Its members are the pillars of direction. Law and order emanate from them to all Israel. Concerning them, the Torah assures us, as it is written, you shall act in accordance with the directions that I give you. And he goes on, this is a positive commandment. When the Rambam, this is one of the 613 commandments, to follow the decree of the ultimate authority, which is the Sanhedrin Hagadol. And the Supreme Court was anyone who believes in Moses, our teacher, and his Torah must relate religious practices to them and lean upon them, meaning you ultimately go to them and you rely on them. When the Supreme Court was in existence, there was no religious dissension amongst the people of Israel. Okay, and he goes on to explain that, and if you go down to the bottom where I have it underlined, when, however, the Supreme Court ceased to exist, religious dissension increased in Israel. One scholar would declare a thing unclean and give a reason for his statement, while another would declare it clean and give it a reason for his statement. One would forbid while the other would permit. So true to what our fear was, when we no longer had one ultimate authority, what developed was different opinions. Authoritative opinions, perhaps based on, as we mentioned in the past, the principles by which we are able to interpret the Torah and the oral Torah. So now we have to figure out, so what do we do with that? That's our next piece. Now the Sefer HaChinuch, which gives the 613 commandments according to the Rambam, has one final thought on that. And also included in this commandment is to listen and do like the commandment of the judge in each and every generation, meaning to say, the great sage that is with us in our times, and one who transgresses this does not listen to the counsel of the great and the wisdom of the Torah, and the generation, according to everything that they instruct, has violated a positive commandment. So the Sefer Chinuch now says, no. So the extension is, in every generation, there are those decisors, those authorities, right, who now are as if it were the representatives of the Sanhedrin. But in each generation, and we're going to see, at one point, it was each generation there were one or two ultimate authorities, right? If you ever learned Pirkei Avot, you had the Zugot, right? You had the peers, you had Hillel, you had Shammai, right? And even though they didn't always agree, they were the ultimately, we would decide based on their opinions, and you had to follow ultimately what the rabbis decided. Now, I just want to add, so it would seem, by the way, it would seem from these sources that rabbinic authority is absolute, right? Infallible, absolute. Now, if you turn to page 151, 152 in the book, I didn't have a chance to put that. So what we'll see is that both Tosafot and the Ramban don't necessarily agree. The Riva was of the opinion that if it comes to when it comes to interpreting the Torah's commandments, if there's a clear mistake in the rabbis, plural, rabbis' instruction, a person is forbidden to listen to them, for a supreme responsibility is to God. So in other words, according to the Riva, Rabbi the Tosafos, it's possible that there's a true mistake. So when there may be a mistake, if the rabbis are fallible and not infallible, then you have to have filled in the Torah law. Now that's a complicated issue. The Ramban, the negative, says the Ramban, the negative on page 152, the negative commandment of lo tasur, you shall not turn left or right from everything that I or the rabbis teach you. That's a biblical commandment, lo tasur, do not churn, right or left from that which I have taught you or which you're instructed, only relates to what the sages said as interpretations of the Torah, like matters that are explicated from the Torah using Zera Shabbat. In other words, that's referring to if they use one of the hermeneutic principles, one of the principles by which we're able to interpret Torah law, and on a Torah law, they decide this is the law, then yes, they have absolute authority. You have to follow their interpretation, right? However, he says, in matters of rabbinic law, then perhaps that is not quite the same. So as we said, once the Sanhedrin Gadol was disbanded, about the time, as I mentioned, right about the end of the Second Temple, right about the time when the Mishnah was being redacted by Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, about 300, 30 years before the Common Era. I'm sorry, right at the beginning of the Common Era. So the nature of the halachic decision making then became altered, because you no longer had one solid central authority in Israel. At first in the Lishkat Gazette, then after, during the Second Temple period, it moved around to a few different places, but they still had the authority of the Sanhedrin. Okay, so the Rambam, in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, explains kind of the historical process of what happened from that point. What happened to decision making? So the Rambam says, consequently, Rabina and Rashi. So who were Rabina and Rashi? They redacted the Talmud. So now we're looking up to like year almost 200 of the Common Era when the Gemara was first redacted, and I'm sorry. Ravina Rav Ashi brought us to the end of the Talmud in Shalom Talmud Bavli. It was about the 200 was when the Mishnah was redacted. The year 500, the Common Era, was when the Talmud was redacted. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So consequently, Ravina Rav Ashi and their associates were the last of the great scholars in Israel who edited the oral Torah, issued edicts, enacted statutes, established customs in their edicts, et cetera, and they were universally accepted by Israel in all the places of their habitation. Now, there's some that want to say that at that point, the oral law was what they called closed. Like you have to, that's like the final word now on oral tradition is with the Talmud. Meaning you have to go back to the Talmud before you can come to any conclusion about any halakha. However, he says, after the court of Rav Ashi, the extent of Israel's dispersion throughout the lands became more general, his extreme points reaching out to distant isles. So what happened? In other words, if you recall, there was several, Rav Yehuda Hanasi, right, after the destruction of the temple, became essential. Jews were beginning to be dispersed at the end of the Second Temple period, to write down what was given as an oral tradition. Right, and therefore how to write it down. The same thing happened now with the Talmud. The Talmud needed to be written down. And now there was even further dispersion. And so, says the Rambam, thus every tribunal founded during the post-Talmudic era in each and every country, which issued edicts and enacted statutes or established customs, either for the inhabitants of its own country alone or the inhabitants of many countries, did not have its authority extended throughout all Israel because of the great distances between the habitations, the unsafe conditions of the highways. Therefore, the people of one state could not be forced to inaugurate the custom of another state. So now what happened was, right, instead of having one universal authority, the Talmud, there was the power was given in each locale, each country, to decide halakha, but it was only necessarily for that group that was under that authority. And that authority didn't extend to, right, so North African authority didn't necessarily extend to European authority. And so now the question was, how could the halacha be decided, right? Does that mean there's ultimate authority, not ultimate authority? So what happened was, up until that point, the rabbis, the sages would go back to the Talmud in order to give an edict that was relevant to their situation, had to find a source in the Talmud. The Talmud was like the end of oral tradition. In other words, psak halacha could come only from the Talmud, from going back to the Talmud. However, and we had some great authorities that decisors, interpreters of the Talmud, and over many centuries. If you have the this that I sent out, this piece that was in the email that I sent you. So what we have is, we had the mission of the Tosefta that were gathered between the beginning of the 1st century through the 2nd century. Then we have from the 2nd century to the 5th century, we have the Talmud Bavli. From the 5th to the 6th, 7th century, you had what was called the Rabbanan Saburai. They were kind of post-Talmudic scholars. But really the next main era was that of the Gaonim, which was from 800 to 1100. You had the Gaonim, Rav Chai Gaon, Saja Gaon, and many others. And then, I forgot to put the date, then from the 11th, 12th, and 13th century, you had Rav Alfasi, the Rif, the Rambam, Maimonides, the Rosh, Rav Asher, 11th, 12th, 13th century decisors of Jewish law, who wrote various compendiums or various commentary on the Talmud. And then you had the Abba Tur, and finally the Shulchan Aruch of Rav Yosef Karo. So at the point that we reach a certain point where there was a need now to kind of have another stopgap, because we have the Talmud, but now we need another authoritative source for halacha. And the Shulchan Aruch became that source. The writings of Rav Yosef Karo. Everybody now goes to the Shulchan Aruch. How is it that the Shulchan Aruch became the authority? Again, if you've read the works, you have all of this. You read through all of this. But essentially, the position of Rav Karo was, I'm going to use the same principle that the Talmud used. We're going to follow the majority, right? Like when the rabbis got together, they would decide who had the majority opinions. If there was a majority opinion, that's what they would follow. If they could get together and could come to some consensus of a majority, that's what they would follow. So Rav Yosef Karo says, I follow the authority of 3 of the poskim: the Rif, the Rush, the Rambam, and the Rush. 3 that you have here between the 11th and 13th century, that I didn't put their dates there. And what he said was, if any 2 of them or all 3 of them agree, that's what I'm putting down as the Psak Halacha. And that's how he wrote the Shulchan Aruch. He writes that in the Beit Yosef, where he brings all the sources. He says wherever there was a majority opinion, that's what he followed. And because of that, because he took that approach, the Shulchan Aruch became the next stop for rabbis to decide halacha. Right? You go to the Gemara, you have to understand the back and forth of the Gemara, but then you want to get to Psak Halacha. If you want to not have to learn through all of the Rif and all of the Rush and all of the Rambam, which true poskim do, you look at the Shulchan Aruch and you will get basically the final opinion. Now, having said that, and he felt it was necessary to write this because he felt the same issue that had happened at the time of the writing of the Gemara and the post, where there was a dispersion, it became even more dispersed. This was necessary to keep halacha, to keep the Torah intact and not have many Torah that would be written. Now, there were some that opposed the idea of creating a halachic compendium. There were those that felt that it would lead to a lack of scholarship, and also that it would lead to a lack of scholarship, and through a lack of scholarship, it would lead to erroneous opinions. You would have rabbis that would decide, they could decide it, they could figure it out on their own. Now, I kind of want to add jump ahead and then jump back. Rav Nyworth mentions this idea of the micropsach, right? That today, and I can tell you it's actually true, right? Today, I'll get a text from somebody, right? And there, I just put my milchik spoon in my fleishik pot with some dairy, whatever. You all know what I'm talking about, right? And I get a text, is the spoon okay? Is the pot okay? Can I eat the food? Do I have to throw it out? What do I do? And you just want the answer. Mutter, aser, it's okay, it's not okay. And that's the world we live in today. I want it called micropsach, right? Just tell me what I need to do. Now, oftentimes, those of you that I try to, when I respond to you, I will give you more information than you asked for. I will tell you why. I will attempt to tell you why I am telling you that this is okay, this is not. And I'll throw out terms and I try to explain to you like not bar not and other halachic ideas as to why, there was no transfer of milchik to fleishik or treif to kosher, because the idea is, if I just tell you asur mutar, okay, not okay, throw it out, kasher it, there's again, you're not engaged in the process. It's just about what do I do, not where does it come from. So I want to digress. There was a book that came out maybe 10 years ago. I think I gave a sermon on one of the high holidays. It was called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. And it was, is the internet weakening our brain? And the premise was the following, and it's relevant to this idea. The premise was, if I ask, 9 times out of 10, if I ask you a question like, who won the Oscar in 1968, right? What are you immediately going to do? Google. You're going to Google it, right? And if I ask almost any question, you're going to Google it. The problem with Googling it is I don't have to really think. I'll just look it up. Well, this goes all the way back. If you recall, originally, the oral Torah was the oral Torah because it couldn't be written down. It had to be transmitted verbally. And think about the generations that we're talking about. The Shulchan Aruch came out right about the time as the first printing press. That's one of the reasons why he felt he was able, because he was able to have access to a lot of other material. The printing press had just come out. Think about the Rush, the Rif, the Rambam. They didn't have a printing press. They didn't have a library. Maybe they had some manuscripts. Maybe they had some manuscripts to look at, but everything was transmitted orally. Think about the level of concentration, right, and bandwidth. Think about mental bandwidth that you have to invest to understand all of these halachot, all of the tradition. But as we built libraries, even before the internet, right? I have a big library at home. So you know what? I can just go, I don't have to think. I can go and look it up. Do I have to memorize every Rashi, every Ramban on the Parsha? No. When the week comes around, I'll pull my Chumash off and I can look up Rashi, the Ramban, and 100 other things. I can I have an app on all my electronics. I have an app called Malachta Chavaderet, right? Or Sefaria. I can look up anything. I can look up anything on my phone. That's great. But what it does is the scholarship is lacking. My scholarship when I do that. So this is what those who argued already in the time of the Shulchan Aruch were making the same argument. That if you're going to write down psak halacha for everything, right? You're going to have it for, you've opened up a Shulchan Aruch or a Mishnah Brura, right? That's where I'm going to go for my final decision. The scholarship, my need to invest myself is less. Now, practically speaking, it's necessary because as the world has grown large, knowledge has, exponentially expanded. Even the Rambam, I don't think, could know, he knew everything about everything for his time, but in the areas I mentioned last week of specialization and detail in every area of human knowledge, human endeavor, it's almost impossible. So that's why we have the Shulchan Aruch became the binding kind of last stop in what we call the oral law, and then we enter into what we call the Acharonim. The Rishonim were the first decisors, ending with the Shulchan Aruch. Shulchan Aruch was the first of the Acharonim. So now we have the following. So now that we gotten to that point, the question is, can we rely on individual opinions? Can we rely on a single opinion? So the answer is, there are certain situations in which we can maybe go back to individual opinions that were not considered the authoritative opinion. When, if it's a shadachak, it's a special situation, it's an emergency situation. As I mentioned last time, like during the pandemic and it's Passover, can I rely on opinions that I wouldn't otherwise rely on, that the majority of rabbis have thrown aside? But somebody was of the opinion that this would be okay, that this is a leniency that might be okay. Or you can say, lo itmar kehilchata. There are those that had the opinion that the halacha was not established according to any one opinion, but to the most authoritative in each situation. And it's for the greatest of each generation, right? What we would call the Posek Hador, the Gadol Hador, right? The great one of their generation. So, for example, in the previous generation, in the 20th century in America, that was Rav Moshe Feinstein. So Rav Moshe Feinstein himself, right? He wrote, it's on page 218 in your book, the Posek's judgment overcomes the written text, but he was always reluctant to rule explicitly against the Shulchan Aruch. In other words, when he says the written text, he's talking about the Shulchan Aruch, right? In other words, he would, on occasion, if he felt that the need was there, that he would disagree with the Shulchan Aruch. One of the things that, so the idea of having a Gadol Hador, now those that were against that idea felt that once you do that, there's a slippery slope, right? What's the slippery slope is, well, I can go from here to here to here, and then at what point am I out of bounds? Right? If so innovation in psak, when do you fall out of bounds? The other idea that is mentioned in the book is the idea of the local authority, the Mara Da'atra. So on the one hand, this idea of you shall not turn to the right or to the left that we started with in terms of looking outside for any other opinion. If you have a Mora Da'atra, if you're part of a local community and you have an authoritative rabbinic leader and he tells you this is the halacha, you're not allowed to go elsewhere to look for another opinion. In fact, you're bound to it. Even if you think he might be incorrect, you're bound to the opinion of the Mora Da'atra. So this is all in the context of rabbinic leadership that is knowledgeable, erudite in all of the areas necessary to make these kinds of decisions. Number one, And as I said, as Aaron Lichtenstein points out, I feel like I'm missing a page here. For a second. Rav Aaron Lichtenstein says, greatness in Torah comes with a tremendous amount of sensitivity and empathy. In other words, you can't be a posek who just reads the black and white. A posek has to have sensitivity and empathy. It has to understand more than just the words that are being asked. And we know that you can have two people come to a rabbi. I've had this situation. Two people can ask the exact same question and get a very different answer. An example, a simple example. Under certain circumstances, we generally don't kosher, for example, pottery, china, things that are made out of earthenware. But if they've sat for a very long time and there is a financial loss or a financial consideration, then you may be able to boil them 3 times, whatever it is that you're allowed to do. Now, I've had people come to me and say, I inherited some china from my grandparents. So there's a difference between china and heirloom china. There's a difference between I have no china and I can't afford to buy any china, and I have 2 sets of china. This would be my 3rd set of china. Okay, so those considerations would determine whether the rabbi would say, you know what, under these circumstances, you can kosher that china or not. That's just one example of the idea of understanding the sense with sensitivity. So with that, I want to get into the other thing I want to talk about 2 ideas: Dat Torah, or Das Torah, and Emunat Chachamim, faith in the sages, in the Chachamim, in the scholars, and because that's going to take us into our next conversation. There's Das Torah and there's Das Torah. There's the Das Torah that is an essential component to the halachic universe, and there's Das Torah that is what separates maybe modern orthodoxy, or our version of modern orthodoxy, from a more Haredi approach to halacha. So the first part of Dat Torah is, as I mentioned, this is part of Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein's presentation, that you have to have Dat Torah. You have to have knowledge of Torah. You cannot be a posek if you're not a great scholar of Torah. All right. Rav Avram Elkanah Shapira, who was a past chief rabbi of Israel, says that Torah is a perspective on a question that fundamentally depends on attitudes and eventualities that are beyond the realm of halakha, but whose foundations are embedded in the Torah. Okay, let me explain. When we talk about Dat Torah, I'm going to ask Das Torah. Means I want to ask a question that is not purely a halachic question, not a halachic question per se, but I want the rabbi's opinion based on his knowledge, both his religious knowledge, his knowledge of me and the situation, his knowledge of the times, whether or not this is okay. So, for example, what if I'm a kohen and I want to become a doctor? That's a halachic question, because there's questions about, well, if you're going to work in a hospital and you're a kohen, you may be in contact with dead corpses. You're in the same building where there might be a morgue, and that might be a problem for you as a kohen. But then there are others who say, no, you know what? Unless you're specialized in a particular area, you shouldn't become a doctor, because doctors have to work on Shabbat. Therefore, you shouldn't become a doctor. But then it can go further than that. you shouldn't become a lawyer because we don't really hold by civil courts, and you're going to have to make decisions in civil court, maybe, or decisions that go against, the Torah. Or then it could be questions that have nothing to do with halacha. Can I leave Teaneck, New Jersey to move to Columbus, Ohio? I'll give you a personal example. I think my parents will appreciate this. When we were selling our house in Worcester, Massachusetts, one of the individuals that was interested in buying the house was one of the teachers in my Chabad day school that I went to, in the Chabad day school, and he was a rabbi, and he came to see the house. And in the living room, or the family room of our house, there were shelves, and like shelves around the walls, and there were these brackets, and the brackets on the shelves were little carvings of like peasants. Somehow they had like a peasant woman, were like the bracket. They were carved wood. They were very beautiful. So the rabbi said, I have to ask the Rebbe, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, if we can buy this house, because there are these graven images, maybe potentially, if that is the case, on these brackets holding up these shelves. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Rebbe told them they couldn't buy the house. Now, I maybe could have told them to take down those shelves. I don't know, but Das Torah can go to that extreme where basically, and the extreme of Das Torah, I'm going to give you. So the positive Das Torah is, listen, I want to consult. My rabbi is a very knowledgeable person. He's a very sensitive person. He's a very empathetic person. And you know what? I really want his opinion. I'm making a big decision with my life, and I want to get his opinion. And Rav Lichtenstein would say, absolutely, you can ask the opinion, but that's not a psak. The Rav, there's a famous story of the Rav. It's actually in the book. I couldn't find it to put the page down. I remember reading it, where back in right about the time that I was entering YU, maybe a little bit before, when there was the Soviet Union, there was the protest for the free Soviet Jews from the Soviet Union, and there was a big demonstration downtown, and some of the students asked their Rebbeim if they could go to the demonstration. So some of them didn't want to go because they'd be missing learning. Some didn't want to go because there'd be all kinds of mixing of genders and whatnot. And they said, and the biggest question was, the big question was, if you go and protest, it's dangerous for the Jews in the Soviet Union because the Russians will retaliate against those Jews. So it's really a question of sakanat nefashot. It's a question of, endangering their lives. You shouldn't go, you're going to endanger your lives. So the Rav apparently heard this, some of the students were leaving, and the buses were outside, and they went and asked the Rav. And the Rav said, so the Rav said, well, if it's dangerous, then, you're going to be concerned about that. So you weren't going to go. And the Rav said, no. I'm not telling you whether to go or not go. I'm telling you should go find a professor or an expert in Russian studies and ask them if this is going to be dangerous for the Russians or not, for the Russian Jews or not. Don't rely on me. I can tell you my opinion. And if it's this, then it's a problem. But I'm not telling you don't go. That's not my role. Tell you, Sakala. So that's the one side of Das Torah. It's okay, and maybe sometimes good advice to ask your rabbi, if you feel that the rabbi is the right person, for advice in life's decisions. But that doesn't mean that the rabbi has absolute authority. However, in certain parts of our religious communities, that is exactly what Das Torah is. The rabbi has absolute authority in every decision in your life. And I'll share with you something that I just read today. So Linda, my wife, sent me a copy of an essay. I don't know if any of you've seen it. Many of you might be familiar with the tragedy of the story of Chaim Walder, Rabbi Walder, who was a Haredi self-help expert. He wrote books and books for children. He was like the superstar of the Haredi world in Israel and in other parts of the Haredi community. He had a podcast that everybody listened to. He he was looked up like a he was a superstar. Well, he also was an incredible pedophile and other things. He did horrible, horrible things. He was finally outed, and actually a couple of weeks ago took his life. And there were those that still to this day defend him, and all the good that he did, and you should keep his books. Others are throwing his books out. But just today there was an essay by a woman who is now married, still observant, still I believe still Haredi, who told her story. And when she was 12 years old, and she was in a Beis Yaakov school, she needed some counseling. Ended up he has a counseling business or whatever. He ended up taking her for counseling. Everybody was amazed. Her parents were super excited. You have, Chaim Walder is your counselor. How lucky are you? How did you win that lottery? All her friends in school, just want to know how she, married to get like this superstar. And meanwhile, every afternoon between in a warehouse, between stacks of books, of his books that everybody was buying and reading, he was raping her on an almost daily basis for a good long time. And and she tells this story, and not to be sensationalistic, but the part that she says is, in the Beis Yaakov system that she was raised in, you were told the rabbi has absolute authority. You never question the rabbi. If the rabbi tells you or says something, it is the word of God, and you listen to it as if it was the word of God. And she says this was drilled into them from day one in their school system, and later on the Beis Yaakov. Never was there any discussion about if any person, including a rabbi, should do X, Y, or Z, you should tell somebody. And it was because of that overbearing idea, extreme, of Das Torah, that there was nobody she could go to. And when she did go to people, they didn't believe her. And it wasn't until much later that she was able to tell her story. But she over and over again in this essay indicts this idea in the education system of Das Torah in the Haredi world as being absolute authority. So when we talk about the contemporary world, this idea of what is Das Torah and what do we consider Das Torah versus what others consider Das Torah or Dat Torah is very, very important. Likewise, the concept of Emunat Chachamim. He talks at great length about Emunat Chachamim in I think it's chapter 5. To have faith in the rabbi's instruction precisely in the situation that we do not fully understand the decisions and rulings. In other words, sometimes you can walk away scratching your head and say, I don't know why or how the rabbi could tell me this, but I have faith. It's not the same as Das Torah. He's not telling me like, this is the opposite, but I have faith that what he's telling me is in fact correct. And again, there are limitations to Emunat Chachamim, but these two things go hand in hand. Dat Torah and Emunat Chachamim, my faith in that this person is in fact knowledgeable and capable and is giving me the correct answer. I have faith in that, unless I know otherwise. I didn't want to spend a lot of time. If you made it through chapter 5 and 6, chapter 7 was pretty interesting. Those are the dry ones. Now we're going to get, next week, we're going to get into some of the more meat, but I do want to raise, so he mentions, Rabbi Neuwirth, this idea of certain halachic meta principles. So I'm not sure, I guess meta principles, because that's a very invoked term. But there are these ideas. I want to throw them out so we come back to them, because it's going to be really now as we get into contemporary questions. So din emet la'amito, right? Literally to judge the truth according to its truth. In other words, judging according to place and times so that it will be truthful. You cannot separate the halacha from the environment in which it's being dealt with, being asked. What's this? Somebody's asking a question there. Yes. Okay. Noted. in other words, you can't paskin halacha out of context. That's social context and other context. Din emet la'amito. If you're going to give a true judgment, it has to be truthful for the situation. You can't just open up the Mishnah Berurah and say the Mishnah Berurah says, therefore that's what you do. Well, but what about? And there we'll discuss that a little bit. There's lifnim mishur tadin. Already back in the Gemara we have this going beyond the letter of the law, right? Compromise. When we talk about court cases, we're told that lifnim mishur tadin, it's I might know I am right and I can win this case. But lifnei mishur tadin might mean shara. Like it's kind of similar to like, do I choose arbitration over a trial? Right, going to court. Because in arbitration, I might not get everything that I want, but there's a more peaceful outcome. Right? So that's kind of what lifnei mishur tadin is. That's how we kind of come up. Maybe it's a higher level of justice. It's not necessarily being right, but it's being just. Kavod habriot. A lot of times, and by the way, these will affect what we consider to be norm. When can we take what we consider normative halacha and say, well, we can tilt this way, we can tilt that way. If we want doing din emet la'amito, we want to really be truthful. We want this to be a good outcome. When it's lifnei mishur tadin, we want it to be beyond the letter. We're willing to go beyond the letter of the law. When there's kavod habriot, when the honor, when human dignity is involved, sometimes we can state a halacha differently. That's only in a rabbinic law. We can't say because of dignity we can violate one of the 39 malachot of Shabbat because of kavod habriot. But maybe we can in one of the other rabbinic laws related to Shabbat. We'll discuss that in a bit. Darkei Shalom. Darkei Shalom is called the ways of peace. So, for example, there are a lot of laws in the Torah that really only apply between Jew and fellow Jew, right? For example, you want to go specifically, the law of do not steal. The law of do not steal means it's a biblical transgression to steal from another Jew. It's not a biblical transgression to steal from a non-Jew. However, the rabbis instituted, no. You are not allowed to steal from a non-Jew. It says, but they darkei shalom. Now, there are different interpretations over time what darkei shalom means. Darkei shalom means, well, if you steal from the non-Jews, they're going to come and kill you, right? They're going to come and, say bad things about you. They're going to say you're cheaters and thieves and, trying to run the world or something like that. So in other words, this idea, but darkei shalom really has become more expansive. And according to Rav Kook, darkei shalom is a general rule now. You're not allowed to, things that you're not allowed to do a fellow Jew, you should not and cannot do to a non-Jew. And that's just, to him, that's as strong a halacha as it can be next to the biblical halacha. And then there's what we call derech eretz. Derech eretz kadma l'Torah, right? Common decency, right? How do these kind of meta principles, where does common decency, where does to create, community beyond the Jewish community or have harmony beyond just the Jewish community? How do we show honor, kavod habriot? How do we reinforce human dignity? How do we go beyond the letter of the law? How do we judge truth to its truthfulness? These are the guidelines now that allow us. Remember, going back to the first class, we talked about fealty to halacha, right? Or fealty to halacha, continuity, versus maintaining a just society, creating a just society. So now we've arrived at that point. We now have the background and the principles and some of the history, especially if you've read through the book. Some of it is slog, some of it is hard to read, some of it's hard to comprehend, but it's now gotten to the point now where we can start to address some contemporary issues and try to figure out who we are as a modern Orthodox community? And how do we deal with a world that is, I want it now, I want it short, I want it quick, and my opinions matter, and I can have my own opinion. How do we deal with that? Where between all of that do we find where do we fit on that narrow bridge that Rabbi Noah was just talking about? So that's now my challenge for the next couple of weeks, is to bring us into that milieu and to try to deal with some of the difficult issues of our day. See how he addresses it, see how maybe we want to address it together. I think one of the last classes we'll do is be more open to some discussion. It might be a little difficult on Zoom, but I'd like to hear what you all think and feel on some of these topics. Anyway, thank you. I hope it was cohesive enough. It was hard to take all the information about the last 200 pages of that book that I just read and put it into a 45-minute, 50-minute session. Thank you all. Have a good evening and a Shabbat Shalom.
Yeshakara, thank you. Kodesh Tov.
Kodesh Tov. By the way, one last note before y'all hang up. The classes are available, and tomorrow, hopefully this won't be available. If you go to our website, on the right side, we're talking classes, a place where you can click the classes that have been recorded, and you can find these classes and listen to them if you want to review or share with anybody else. Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you. I had a question for you.
Thank you.
Nothing to do with this.
Okay.